Lena lived a life of simplicity, but not one without purpose. In her small, close-knit town, she was known for her kind heart and unshakable determination. She spent her mornings teaching children at the local school and her afternoons helping her mother with household chores. In her quiet moments, she would often sit by the window, staring at the horizon, wondering if there was something more to life. She didn't resent her modest existence. It was filled with love and honesty, but a part of her couldn't help but dream of a world beyond the narrow streets of her village. One warm afternoon, as Lena walked home from the market with a basket of groceries, a sleek black luxury car rolled up beside her. The window slid down, and she saw a man with sharp features and a gentle smile. His wheelchair was just visible inside the car. "Excuse me," he called out in a voice that carried both confidence and warmth. "Could you tell me how to get to the old library?" Lena hesitated for a moment, taken aback by his polished appearance. It wasn't every day that someone like him came to their town. She adjusted the basket on her arm and pointed down the road. "It's just past the bakery, sir. You can't miss it." He smiled, his gaze lingering on her as though he were committing her face to memory. "Thank you. It's rare to find someone so helpful." Lena smiled politely and continued on her way, but the encounter stayed with her. She had seen many visitors pass through her town, but this man was different. His sophistication stood in stark contrast to the humble surroundings, and yet there was something in his eyes, a sadness, perhaps, that made her wonder about his story. The man began to appear more frequently in the town. Lena learned his name was Zaid, a wealthy businessman from the city who had recently purchased an estate nearby. Rumors quickly spread about his fortune and the tragic accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down. Despite his wealth, he often visited the local library, the park, and the market. He seemed to enjoy the simplicity of the town, and slowly, Lena found herself crossing paths with him more often. One day, as she sat on a bench at the park, reading a worn-out book, Zaid approached her. "May I join you?" he asked, his wheelchair gliding silently over the cobblestones. Lena hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course." They sat in silence for a while, the chirping of birds filling the space between them. Finally, Zaid spoke. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Lena looked up, curious. "Who?" He smiled faintly. "My mother. She was kind, humble, and had a way of making people feel at ease. Just like you." Lena blushed, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to such compliments, especially from someone like him. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes returning to her book. Over time, Zaid and Lena began to talk more. Their conversations were light at first, about books, the weather, and the town. But as the weeks went by, Zaid started to open up about his life. He told her about his business empire, his travels, and the accident that had changed everything. Lena listened intently, her heart aching for him as he spoke of the challenges he faced. Despite his wealth and success, Zaid's life was lonely. His friends admired his power, but few understood the weight he carried. In Lena, he found something he hadn't felt in years: genuine kindness. She didn't see him as a billionaire or a man bound to a wheelchair. She saw him as a person. For Lena, Zaid represented a world she had only read about in books. His stories of grand cities and luxurious mansions fascinated her, but they also made her feel small. She couldn't imagine fitting into his world, yet she couldn't deny the connection growing between them. One evening, Zaid invited Lena to his estate. She had never seen anything like it. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light of chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with priceless art. It was a world of opulence that felt completely foreign to her. As they sat in his grand living room, Zaid turned to her with a serious expression. "Lena," he began, his voice trembling slightly, You've brought something into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. You've shown me kindness, compassion, and a reason to smile again. I know this might come as a surprise, but I want you to be my wife." Lena froze, her heart racing. She looked at the small velvet box in his hand, the diamond ring inside sparkling like a star. She didn't know what to say. A part of her was flattered. Who wouldn't be? Zaid was offering her a life of comfort and security, a chance to escape the struggles of her humble existence. But another part of her felt overwhelmed. Could she truly leave behind everything she knew? Could she love a man she barely understood? Zaid seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to answer now," he said gently. "Take your time. I just want you to know how much you mean to me." That night, Lena lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Marrying Zaid would change her life forever. She would no longer have to worry about money or the future. Her family would be proud, and her friends would envy her. But deep down, she wasn't sure if this was the life she wanted. She thought about Zaid, his kindness, his vulnerability, and the way he looked at her as if she were his entire world. She felt a pang of guilt. He deserved someone who could love him wholeheartedly, not someone who was still unsure of her feelings. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, Lena made a decision. She would give Zaid an answer, but it wouldn't come easily. Her heart was torn between duty and desire, between the life she knew and the life he was offering. Lena's decision to accept Zaid's proposal was not made lightly. It was a choice driven by hope and fear in equal measure. Hope that this union might bring her happiness, and fear of disappointing her family if she refused. The day she said yes, Zaid's face lit up with a joy she had never seen before. For a moment, she felt she had made the right decision. But as days turned into weeks, doubt began to creep into her heart. Lena's life changed almost overnight. From the simplicity of her small-town existence, she was thrust into a world of luxury and excess. Zaid insisted on taking care of her family, sending them gifts and paying off their debts. Her parents were thrilled, their eyes shining with pride every time they mentioned Zaid's name. "You're so lucky, Lena," her mother would say, her voice filled with awe. "He's giving you everything we could never provide." But for Lena, the transition was far from easy. She felt like an outsider in Zaid's world. The grand mansion, the expensive clothes, and the constant attention from his staff were overwhelming. She missed the simplicity of her old life, the quiet evenings by the window, the laughter of her students, and the comfort of her own identity. Zaid, however, was patient and attentive. He showered her with affection, trying to make her feel at home. "You don't have to change who you are," he told her one evening as they sat in the mansion's sprawling garden. "I love you for your simplicity, Lena. That's what makes you special." Lena smiled at his words, but deep down, she felt a growing sense of unease. Was she truly being herself, or was she slowly losing her identity in the shadow of Zaid's wealth? As the wedding day approached, the pressure on Lena intensified. Zaid's family, though polite, made it clear that they had high expectations of her. They spoke of the responsibilities she would have as Zaid's wife, the social circles she would need to navigate, and the image she would need to uphold. Lena listened silently, nodding when necessary, but her heart sank with every word. Her own family, on the other hand, was ecstatic. They viewed Zaid as a savior, someone who had lifted them out of their struggles. "You're living a fairy tale, Lena," her father said one evening. "Do you know how many girls dream of a life like yours?" But it didn't feel like a fairy tale to Lena. It felt like a cage, gilded and beautiful, but suffocating all the same. One evening, as Lena sat in the library of Zaid's mansion, she came across an old photograph of him. In the picture, Zaid was standing tall, his eyes full of life and confidence. It was taken before his accident, and the man in the photograph seemed like a stranger compared to the Zaid she knew now. She turned the photograph over and saw a handwritten note on the back. "Never take life for granted." The words struck a chord in her. Zaid had faced unimaginable loss, and yet had managed to build a life of success and resilience. She admired his strength, but it also made her question her own. Was she strong enough to face the challenges of their future together? Could she truly be the partner he needed? Her thoughts were interrupted when Zaid entered the room. "You found my old photos," he said with a soft smile, wheeling himself closer to her. "I used to think life was all about power and control. Then, the accident happened, and everything changed." Lena looked at him, her heart aching. "How did you move on?" she asked. Zaid's smile faltered, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "But when I met you, I realized that maybe life was giving me a second chance. This time, not to control it, but to appreciate it." His words stayed with Lena long after he left the room. They were filled with sincerity, but they also added to her burden. She didn't want to disappoint him, but she wasn't sure if she could meet his expectations. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Designers, florists, and caterers flooded the mansion, each determined to make the event a spectacle. Lena felt like a puppet in their hands, her preferences and opinions often dismissed in favor of what would look best. One day, during a fitting for her wedding dress, Lena finally snapped. "This isn't me," she said, pulling away from the designer. "I don't want a dress that costs more than my family earns in a year. I don't want any of this." The room fell silent and all eyes turned to her. Zaid, who had been watching from the doorway, wheeled himself forward. "Lena," he said gently, "it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But this wedding is as much about you as it is about me. Tell me what you want, and we'll make it happen." Lena looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just want to feel like myself again," she whispered. Zaid reached for her hand. "You're already everything I could ever want," he said. "We can make this wedding as simple or as grand as you like. Just promise me one thing. Don't lose yourself. That's the Lena I fell in love with." His words were comforting, but they didn't erase her doubts. If she had to fight this hard to feel like herself now, what would it be like after the wedding? One evening, Lena decided to visit her old home. She hadn't been there since she accepted Zaid's proposal, and she felt a desperate need to reconnect with her past. As she walked through the familiar streets, memories flooded back. The laughter of her friends, the warmth of her mother's cooking, and the simplicity of a life that now seemed so distant. When she reached her family's house, her mother greeted her with open arms. "Lena, you look like a princess," she said, her eyes filled with pride. "Zaid has given you so much. You're so lucky." Lena forced a smile, but inside, her heart felt heavy. Was luck really the right word? She didn't feel lucky. She felt lost. That night, as she lay in her childhood bed, she realized something important. Her life with Zaid was a dream come true for her family, but it wasn't her dream. She had agreed to marry him out of duty and gratitude, but she wasn't sure if she could build a life on those foundations. The next morning, Lena returned to Zaid's mansion with a newfound sense of determination. She needed to confront her feelings, to understand whether her doubts were temporary or a sign of something deeper. When she saw Zaid, he greeted her with his usual warmth. "You were gone all night," he said. "I missed you." Lena hesitated, her heart pounding. "Zaid," she began, "do you ever wonder if we're making the right choice?" Zaid's expression softened. "Every day," he admitted. "But life is full of uncertainty, Lena. All we can do is follow our hearts." His words were meant to reassure her, but they only deepened her conflict. What if her heart was telling her to walk away? The day of the wedding arrived like an unstoppable tide, washing over Lena's emotions in waves of dread and anticipation. The mansion was alive with activity. Florists arranging delicate blooms, chefs preparing lavish meals, and guests arriving in glittering attire. Lena stood in front of the mirror in her room, her reflection almost unrecognizable. The elaborate wedding gown sparkled under the light, a vision of perfection. Yet beneath the layers of fabric, she felt like an imposter. Her maid of honor, Amal, entered the room with a bright smile. "Lena, you look breathtaking. Zaid will be speechless when he sees you." Lena forced a smile, her hands gripping the edges of the vanity table. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Amal noticed her hesitation and walked over, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Nervous?" she asked gently. Lena nodded, unable to meet her friend's gaze. Nervous wasn't the word. She felt trapped, like a bird in a gilded cage, its wings clipped by the weight of expectation. As the hours ticked by, Lena found herself seeking solace in the quiet corners of the mansion. She wandered through the garden, where the scent of roses filled the air, and found herself at the edge of the fountain where she and Zaid had once shared a moment of quiet conversation. She remembered his laughter, his stories, and the way he looked at her as if she were his whole world. He was kind, generous, and everything she had been taught to admire in a husband. But was admiration enough? Was it love? She thought about her family, their pride in her, and their excitement about the wedding. To them, this union was a dream come true. A humble girl marrying a man of extraordinary wealth. Yet Lena couldn't ignore the voice inside her that whispered of a life unlived, of choices made for others and not for herself. Back in the mansion, Zaid was in his private study, surrounded by his closest friends and family. Despite the celebratory atmosphere, he looked anxious. His brother Omar noticed and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Relax, Zaid. Today is your day. Lena will make you the happiest man alive." Zaid smiled faintly but said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Lena had been distant lately, her smiles fleeting and her words weighed down by an unspoken burden. He wanted to ask her if she was truly happy, but he feared the answer. Minutes before the ceremony, Zaid wheeled himself to Lena's room, asking for a private moment. She turned to see him at the door, dressed impeccably in a custom suit, his eyes full of hope. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you," Lena replied, her voice trembling. Zaid studied her face, his expression growing serious. "Lena, I need to know, are you happy with this? With me?" Her heart sank. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess the storm raging inside her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced a smile. "Of course, Zaid. Everything is perfect." But Zaid wasn't convinced. "If there's ever a moment when you feel unsure, Lena, please tell me. I only want what's best for you." His words were both comforting and devastating. He deserved honesty, but Lena didn't have the courage to give it. The grand hall was a vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and rows of guests sat in anticipation. Lena stood at the entrance, her father by her side, ready to walk her down the aisle. The music began, soft and melodic, signaling her cue. Her heart pounded as she took her first step, the weight of her gown and her doubts pressing down on her. The room seemed to blur, the faces of the guests fading into the background as her eyes locked on Zaid. He waited for her at the altar, his expression a mixture of love and vulnerability. As she walked closer, memories of their time together flashed through her mind. The laughter they shared, the stories he told, and the quiet moments that revealed his soul. But alongside those memories were visions of the life she had left behind, her family, her dreams, and the freedom to choose her own path. When Lena reached the altar, the officiant began the ceremony. His words were a blur to her, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. As he asked her to declare her vows, she hesitated, the silence stretching painfully. "Lena?" Zaid's voice broke through the haze, filled with concern. She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. The love and trust in his gaze were unbearable. She couldn't do it. She couldn't lie to him, to herself, to everyone in the room. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't." Gasps rippled through the audience as Lena stepped back, her tears spilling over. She turned and ran, her gown trailing behind her like a shadow of the life she was leaving behind. Lena didn't stop running until she reached the garden. She collapsed onto a bench, her chest heaving as sobs racked her body. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of relief. She had chosen freedom, even if it came at a cost. Back in the hall, chaos erupted. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Zaid sat motionless, his heart shattered. He had feared this moment, but now that it had come, it was more painful than he could have imagined. Omar approached him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Zaid, let her go. She needs time." Zaid nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the empty aisle. "I just wanted her to be happy," he murmured. Lena returned to her family's home that night, her wedding gown still trailing behind her like a ghost of the life she had nearly chosen. Her parents were shocked, their joy turned to confusion and disappointment. "Lena, what have you done?" her mother cried. "Do you know what this means for us?" "I'm sorry," Lena said, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry him." Her father sighed deeply, his face a mixture of anger and sadness. "You've embarrassed us, Lena. Do you even realize what you've thrown away?" But Lena didn't respond. She simply retreated to her room, closing the door behind her. As she sat on her bed, staring at the moonlight streaming through the window, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had made a choice, a difficult, painful choice, but it was hers. The next morning, Lena woke with a heavy heart but a clearer mind. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with questions and judgments. But she also knew that she had reclaimed her life, her voice, and her freedom. As she stood at the window, watching the world outside, she whispered to herself, "I'll find my way." The air outside the mansion was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. Lena's heart raced as she stumbled through the garden, her wedding gown catching on the edges of rose bushes. She didn't look back, even as the muffled sounds of shocked guests echoed faintly behind her. Her mind was a whirlwind, her body trembling as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She had made her choice. She had to leave, even if it meant shattering everything. The grand gates of the mansion loomed ahead, their iron bars polished to a shine. For a brief moment, Lena hesitated. Her hands clutched the heavy fabric of her gown, and her chest heaved with the weight of her emotions. She knew there was no turning back, no undoing what she had just done. With a deep breath, she pushed the gates open and stepped into the quiet streets beyond. The streets were eerily silent, the cobblestones glistening under the soft glow of street lamps. Lena pulled off her veil, letting it fall to the ground behind her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she needed to get away. Her thoughts raced, each one louder than the last. What have I done? Will Zaid ever forgive me? Have I ruined everything? She wiped away tears as she quickened her pace, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Her gown felt heavier with every step, a physical reminder of the life she had just walked away from. But even as her body ached and her mind screamed in confusion, There was a small, quiet voice inside her, one that whispered of freedom. Lena eventually found herself at the edge of town, standing in front of an old cottage she had visited often in her childhood. It belonged to an elderly woman named Sophia, a family friend who had always treated Lena like a granddaughter. The warm glow of a single lamp shone through the window, and Lena hesitated for only a moment before knocking softly on the door. Sophia opened the door, her wrinkled face softening with surprise and concern when she saw Lena in her wedding gown, her cheeks streaked with tears. "Lena, my dear," she said, stepping aside to let her in. "What's happened? Come inside, quickly." Lena stepped into the cozy cottage, the scent of freshly brewed tea and old books wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I left Sophia," she whispered. "I couldn't go through with it." Sophia sat across from her, her wise eyes studying Lena carefully. "Why, child? What made you run?" Tears welled up in Lena's eyes as she struggled to find the words. "I wasn't ready. It didn't feel right. Zaid is a wonderful man, but I couldn't live a life that wasn't mine." Sophia nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, doing the right thing for yourself feels like the hardest thing in the world. But you've done something brave, Lena. You've chosen to be true to yourself." Back at the mansion, the aftermath of Lena's escape was unfolding. The guests were in a state of shock, their whispers filling the grand hall like a swarm of bees. Zaid sat silently at the altar, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His family surrounded him, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. "What was she thinking?" one of his aunts muttered. "How could she humiliate us like this?" Omar, Zaid's brother, stepped forward. "Enough," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This isn't about us. This is about Zaid and Lena. We don't know what she's going through." Zaid finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "She must have had her reasons," he said, his eyes fixed on the doorway where Lena had disappeared. "I just wish she had told me." As the staff began to clear the hall, one of Zaid's assistants approached him with an envelope in hand. "Sir," he said, "we found this in her room." Zaid took the envelope, his heart sinking as he recognized Lena's handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands, unfolding the letter inside. "Dear Zaid, I'm so sorry for leaving this way. You didn't deserve this, and I didn't want to hurt you. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I'll always be grateful for everything you've done for me and my family. But I realized something today, something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't ready for this marriage, and it wouldn't have been fair to either of us if I had gone through with it. You deserve someone who can love you with their whole heart, and I wasn't sure if I could be that person for you. Please forgive me, Zaid. I hope you find the happiness you truly deserve. Lena." Zaid read the letter twice, his heart breaking with each word. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, his mind racing with emotions. Sadness, anger, and a flicker of understanding all battled for dominance. The following morning, Lena woke up in Sophia's cottage, the sunlight streaming through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm. She made her way to the kitchen where Sophia was brewing tea. "Did you sleep, child?" Sophia asked, her voice gentle. "A little," Lena admitted. She sat down at the table, her hands wrapped around the warm mug Sophia placed in front of her. "I don't know what comes next." Sophia smiled knowingly. "That's the beauty of it, Lena. You've given yourself a chance to figure it out. Life isn't about following a path that others have laid out for you. It's about creating your own." Lena nodded, her chest feeling lighter. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she felt like she had the space to find them. Days turned into weeks, and Zaid threw himself into his work. The pain of Lena's departure lingered, but he refused to let it consume him. He focused on rebuilding his life, channeling his energy into new projects and philanthropy. One evening, as he sat in his study, he pulled out Lena's letter. Reading her words again, he felt a sense of closure. She had made a choice, not to hurt him, but to stay true to herself. And while it hurt, he couldn't blame her for that. She was braver than I gave her credit for, he murmured to himself. Lena returned to her town, slowly piecing her life back together. She resumed teaching, finding joy in the laughter of her students and the simplicity of her days. She often thought of Zaid, wondering if he had moved on, if he had found someone who could give him the love he deserved. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, she stopped to admire a small flower stall. The vendor smiled at her. "You're glowing today, Lena. What's the occasion?" Lena smiled back, her heart full of quiet contentment. "No occasion," she said. "Just life." She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out. The days after the wedding that never was passed in a haze of emotions for Lena. Back in her small town, life seemed unchanged on the surface, yet everything felt different to her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, neighbors curious but too polite to ask directly about the dramatic events. Her parents avoided the topic, their disappointment simmering beneath forced smiles. Lena carried the weight of their unspoken judgment alongside her own guilt and uncertainty. Still, in the quiet moments of solitude, Lena began to feel something new: freedom. It wasn't the euphoric kind she had read about in books, but a quiet, steady realization that she had taken control of her life. She had walked away from a path that didn't feel right, even though it had been paved with luxury and comfort. And in doing so, she had rediscovered her ability to choose. Lena sat in the park one afternoon, the place where she had first truly spoken with Zaid. The memory of his warm smile and the way he had opened up to her lingered in her mind. She felt a pang of guilt for leaving him so abruptly. He had been nothing but kind and sincere, and she couldn't shake the thought that she had hurt him deeply. But as the autumn leaves swirled around her, Lena reminded herself why she had made the choice to leave. It wasn't about Zaid. It was about her. She had been suffocating under the weight of expectations, drowning in a world that wasn't hers. She knew now that marrying Zaid would have meant losing herself, and she wasn't willing to make that sacrifice. Still, she wondered about him. How was he coping? Had he moved on? Did he hate her? Back at his mansion, Zaid was navigating his own path of healing. The initial days after Lena's departure had been the hardest. He had replayed her words in his mind, trying to understand what he had missed, what he could have done differently. The emptiness she left behind was palpable, and for a time, he allowed himself to wallow in the pain. But Zaid was no stranger to adversity. His life had been a series of challenges, from the accident that had changed everything to the relentless demands of his business empire. Slowly, he began to channel his heartbreak into something constructive. He threw himself into his work, launching new philanthropic initiatives aimed at helping people with disabilities. If Lena had taught him anything, it was the importance of kindness and understanding, and he wanted to pay that forward. One evening, as Zaid reviewed a report in his study, he came across the letter Lena had left for him. He hadn't read it since the day of the wedding, and now, weeks later, he felt ready to revisit her words. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring content like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to like this video and share where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As he unfolded the paper, her delicate handwriting brought a pang of nostalgia. He read the letter slowly, absorbing each word. Her sincerity was undeniable, and though it hurt to relive the pain of her departure, he found himself appreciating her honesty. She hadn't run away out of malice or cowardice. She had done it because she needed to stay true to herself. Zaid closed his eyes, the letter resting on his desk. For the first time since the wedding, He felt a sense of peace. Lena had made her choice, and now he needed to make his own. He couldn't hold on to the past. He had to move forward. As the weeks turned into months, Lena began to rebuild her life. She returned to teaching, finding solace in the laughter of her students and the simplicity of her daily routines. The whispers in the town gradually faded, and though her parents were still disappointed, they began to accept her decision. Lena didn't expect their approval, but she was grateful for their quiet support. One day, while walking through the market, Lena paused at a small flower stall. The vendor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, handed her a single white rose. "You've been carrying a heavy heart, child," she said. "But I see something in you, a light that wasn't there before. Whatever you've been through, it's made you stronger." Lena smiled, touched by the woman's words. She realized she did feel stronger. She had faced judgment, heartbreak, and uncertainty, but she had also found a clarity she had never known before. For the first time in her life, she was living on her own terms. Months later, fate intervened in an unexpected way. Lena was visiting a nearby city to attend a seminar for teachers. As she wandered through the bustling streets, she stumbled upon a small art gallery. Intrigued, she stepped inside, her eyes drawn to a series of paintings that depicted scenes of resilience and hope. One painting in particular caught her attention, a vivid depiction of a bird breaking free from its cage. As she studied the piece, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "It's about finding freedom," the voice said softly. Lena turned and froze. There, in his wheelchair, was Zaid. He looked different, more relaxed, his eyes less burdened by sadness. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. "It's good to see you, Lena," Zaid said finally, his tone warm but measured. Lena's heart raced. "Zaid, I didn't expect to see you here." They moved to a quiet corner of the gallery, where they talked for the first time since the wedding. Zaid told her about his new projects, his focus on philanthropy, and the lessons he had learned about letting go. Lena shared her journey of self-discovery, the challenges she had faced, and the strength she had found within herself. By the time they parted ways, there was no bitterness between them, only a sense of mutual respect and understanding. They had both grown, and though their paths had diverged, they were grateful for the role they had played in each other's lives. As Lena walked away from the gallery, she felt lighter than she had in months. Seeing Zaid had given her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. He was thriving, and so was she. They had both found their own versions of freedom, their own paths forward. Back in her town, Lena continued to embrace her new life. She poured her heart into her work, took up painting as a hobby, and even started writing about her experiences. Her story wasn't one of regret or missed opportunities. It was one of growth, resilience, and the courage to choose oneself. For Zaid, the encounter with Lena was a turning point. He realized he no longer carried the pain of her departure. Instead, he felt gratitude for the time they had shared and the lessons he had learned. He continued his work with renewed vigor, determined to make a difference in the lives of others. One evening, as he sat in his study, he glanced at the birdcage painting Lena had admired in the gallery. It now hung on his wall, a reminder of the beauty of freedom and the strength it took to embrace it. Life had taken Lena and Zaid on separate journeys, but those paths had taught them both invaluable lessons. They had faced heartbreak, uncertainty, and change, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more in tune with who they truly were. In the end, their story wasn't about loss. It was about transformation. And though they no longer walked the same path, they would always carry a piece of each other in their hearts. A reminder of the courage it took to let go and the beauty of finding oneself. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring content like this,